The COVID-19 pandemic has without a doubt brought so many problems and challenges to countries in both the developed and the developing world. However, as one would expect, the painful effect it has had in the already struggling developing world will be felt for years to come. This is why African countries have found themselves in this cap-in-hand position before their wealthy donor nations, particularly their Western donor nations. In addition to the foreign aid that has already been pouring into Africa in the last couple of decades, this year, additional funding is now being given to African nations under the title of COVID relief funds. So with this new foreign aid situation, much of the COVID relief funds are coming with conditions and clauses that either directly or indirectly open the door to the international abortion organizations, as Western donors are demanding themselves more access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, sometimes referred to as SRHR. Some donors are going as far as earmarking some of their relief donor funds for this particular purpose. This means that at a time when there is dire basic human needs like food and basic medicines, donors seem to be much more concerned with furthering the territories of the abortion movement and the sexual and reproductive health movement. So strengthened by this new infusion of donor funds, at a time when many communities find themselves weakened and vulnerable under the burden of a global pandemic, abortion advocacy groups and sexual and reproductive health and rights organizations have made inroads into some African countries. In these countries, we are now seeing fierce attempts to push for the legalization of abortion as well as other things. My name is Obianuju Ekeocha, and for the past 8 years I have been investigating the relationship between African countries and their wealthy Western donors. Why is it that at this time, when countries and communities find themselves in the most vulnerable situation, should the abortion movement be moving to take advantage of these communities? Why is it that at a time like this, that some Western leaders and Western donors should be pushing for their own sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda? Why is it that at this time, the United Nations is coming out full force to align so perfectly with pro-abortion ideas and ideologies and pro-abortion groups? Why exactly is it happening, and why now?
My name is Alyssa Quarren. I'm the Director of UN Advocacy for ADF International, and I'm a pro-life advocate at the United Nations. I work at the United Nations to defend the value of unborn life and to assist diplomats from countries all over the world in making sure that the texts that the UN produces hold clear the values of international law in this regard.
It's such a pleasure, Elise, and I had the pleasure of meeting you. I think it was back in 2014 when we were all gathered for the CSW, Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations, and what a privilege to have met you. And what I just feel about your work is that you are such an expert. You were good with the diplomats, you were good with the delegates, you were good with the NGOs. So thank you so much for everything that you do.
That's such an honor. Thank you.
Let's just delve right into it, Elisa. Given what has been happening since the beginning of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has really come to all of us as a shock, I think the entire world has really been shocked by this pandemic, to say the least. Many people this year have had to, for the first time ever perhaps, have had to face some kind of a discrimination, in a sense of speaking, within their own healthcare providers. People are hearing things like you cannot have a surgery or procedure just because it's not classed as an essential healthcare. But we saw that in this same year, the powers that be and the authorities, the healthcare authorities, and you'll tell us all about them in a minute, the healthcare authorities then told us or declared and stated that abortion is actually an essential healthcare service. So can you talk a little bit about that, particularly starting from what happened in the United States with the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, ACOG, and their statement back in March of this year?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's exactly the point, is that we all saw that with the start of the pandemic, the healthcare system in a lot of places around the world was overloaded. And there was the need to take certain services and to push them back or to delay things that were elective. And what we saw was that abortion advocates, abortion activists, were very adamant that abortion not be classified as such, that access to abortion not be delayed. And so we saw very early on, right after the pandemic started, this trend to not only ensure that what was going on with the pandemic did not delay access to abortion, but that they would end up at the end of this, so when COVID-19 is over and when we've moved on as a society and as a world, that they're actually further ahead than they were before with regard to how close they're coming to getting their ultimate goal, which is the achievement of an international human right to abortion. So we know that's where they're headed, and we know that that's what they're trying to do, and essentially manipulate what's going on right now in the context of the pandemic to achieve that goal. And the first step was very early, like I said. It was in March, and it was the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists announced that abortion was to be classified as an essential service. So this means that when it comes to administering healthcare, hospitals, doctors, clinicians, they have to ensure that abortion isn't downgraded, so that if someone comes in for an abortion, it can't be delayed under the reason of the pandemic. So very soon after that, we saw that the trend was continued because the World Health Organization, the WHO, said the same thing. So once again, they classified abortion. This was very early on, again, right after, in April, they said abortion was an essential service. And this time they directed it specifically to governments. They told governments, you have to ensure that abortion is offered as an essential service to anyone that wants it during the course of the pandemic.
So tell us what you know about the donor nations and how they came in with regards to funding developing countries as it pertains to COVID-19.
Canada in particular stepped up right away, and they offered almost $9 million, in particular for sexual and reproductive health care services, which we know in UN parlance means abortion in the developing world. So this is money to promote abortion, to offer access to abortion in countries where abortion is usually illegal or highly restricted. And this is going in tandem. So you have the call from ACOG, from the obstetricians and gynecologists. You have the call from the WHO. So this is going in tandem with the calls from international medical activists, from the international bureaucracy, and then you have the money coming right up alongside of it to ensure that abortion becomes a reality in these countries. And so you run into essentially a catch-22, where these are countries that need the COVID money, but at the same time, they want to protect the laws and policies that they have in place that protect the right to life of the unborn.
This brings me to something that I actually got to read in an article that you had written that was published a couple of months back. And I was actually quite excited when I read it because I learned a term that I had never come across before, but I'm sure I'm going to use many, many times in the future. You called it humanitarian blackmail. Can you talk a bit about the humanitarian blackmail, especially with regards to what happened in the United Nations at a point when they were putting together a UN document about nutrition and COVID?
Yes, absolutely. So every year we have this process at the United Nations in New York called the Commission on Population and Development. And it's basically the foremost meeting place, the foremost international session for governments to come together and to hash out issues pertaining to development. And this year the theme that was chosen was nutrition. And they decided that because of the pandemic that they were going to overlay the COVID-19 climate on top of the nutrition theme and discuss COVID and nutrition together. And so if you look at this, you think there's no way that abortion activists can kind of come in here and use this, usurp this as a chance to promote abortion. And nonetheless, they were able to. You have countries on the brink of starvation, famines all over the world, really exacerbated by the COVID-19 climate. And so a text like this coming from the UN is extremely important. And at the end of the day, they weren't able to produce a text. And the reason for this was that a few of the countries, European countries in particular, refused to accept a text that didn't mention abortion as an essential service in the context of the pandemic. This is humanitarian blackmail.
It is unbelievable that the African nations at this point at the mercy of people who have all these views, all these ideological concepts, and these plans to push through their own ideas and ideologies. Well, I'm so very grateful to you, Elisa, for coming on to speak with me about some of these things and just giving us your expertise, telling us what you know happening, especially on the UN front and among the international communities. Very, very illuminating and very enlightening for so many people. So thank you for coming on with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
My name is Zach Kaulala. I'm involved in a number of things, but largely I'm the chairman for Ethics, Peace and Justice Commission of the Evangelical Association of Malawi, and I'm also the chaplain for the Fraternity of Evangelicals in Parliament, that's in the Malawi Parliament. Apart from that, I'm a minister of the gospel with a number of churches under my oversight. I'm passionate about life, about the preservation of life. By the time we started having people testing positive for COVID-19 in Malawi, it was like we never knew it was coming. It was like our health facilities were not ready for it. In terms of beds for people that would be taken ill, we're not prepared. We didn't have ventilators. Anyway, the health care system in Malawi is far from anything to be admired. And that's the situation. That's the basic situation.
That goes without saying. I mean, most of the African countries are pretty much in the same situation. But I've been to Malawi, and I will confirm that for you as well, that it is quite difficult. In fact, some of the statistics I saw in an article dated April of this year, April 2020, was saying that there were just in the whole country about only 25 ICU, intensive care unit beds, and only about 7 ventilators. That's what you might have in one UK hospital, and imagine that being what an entire country is now expected to share. But that takes me to my next question, which I think you very much know a lot about. It really has to do with then what happened again towards the beginning of this pandemic that had everyone running, for the shelters. That in this year, when we've experienced a pandemic like COVID-19, someone then brought in an abortion bill into Parliament. Can you tell me about that attempt to push through abortion or an abortion bill during a COVID-19 pandemic?
In the midst of a pandemic, mobilization starts again, advocacy starts again among our traditional leaders, among the clergy, among members of parliament, be taken out to conferences and workshops to be taught you need to pass this bill of abortion in the time when the country should have been focusing on COVID-19. I believe it's just ill-timed that such a thing would come into the country. They start to mobilize traditional chiefs and a clergy, and some of the clergy actually formed a coalition of pro-choice people, unfortunately. And some chiefs were buying into what IPAS and COPUA were doing. And they moved the members of parliament. Some of us, instead of being on air to talk about COVID-19, we're having to go on the different media channels to talk about abortion and say, this vice, we don't need it. It's not even a time for us to be discussing it. Now, further to that, we moved on to bring a consultation with members of parliament. So we wrote the Speaker of Parliament through my commission with the Ethics, Peace and Justice Commission to say we would like to bring another voice to the members of parliament, knowing quite well that IPAS had been taking these members of parliament to dinners, to luncheons, to seminars, to tell them that they need to pass this bill in parliament. And we decided that we're going to meet members of parliament. The speaker made an announcement in parliament and say the Ethics, Peace and Justice Commission would like to address members of parliament on the issue, and we did that.
Can you tell me a bit about it? Like, what was the reaction of the MPs, or what were they saying about how they were going to vote on the abortion bill?
We had about 125 members of parliament out of the 188 at that time. The House was 188 members. Members of Parliament said, no, we don't need it. And that just agreed with what one media house, one of the well-known media house, Nation Publications, had a survey among members of Parliament. And they got to register over 80% of members of Parliament saying, we don't need this bill in Parliament. In Malawi, right, the Malawians, the people in this nation are not for this bill, changing. It's the West trying to impose itself upon the laws of Malawi. Now, in law formulation, we don't need a sponsor coming to tell us what laws we should have in this nation. We should be allowed to go through our own processes. And if the people of Malawi, through their members of Parliament, are saying no to abortion bills being reviewed, then let the West stay put. Leave Malawians decide for Malawians.
This is the constant theme that I tend to see, it not only in Malawi, but in different African countries. There's always this fact that people say, nobody is wanting abortion. People are not really asking for abortion in this country, but yet we keep seeing this strong force pushing for abortion, bringing an abortion bill all the way almost to Parliament. But then who is paying for this, Dr. Zach? Who is paying for some of these things to happen?
The first survey that went on in Malawi was conducted by IPAS. IPAS is an American international organization, and they had their own local grouping, a coalition called COPUA. And then the second one was done by Guttmacher Institute. The funding is not local. It's not the Malawi government. It is some two institutions, Guttmacher and IPAS, funding a certain gynecologist and a local institution, COPUA, going around paying big money.
What exactly are the Malawi people needing from your own point of view, especially within the coronavirus pandemic?
What we need is a good maternal care.
Right.
We need good maternal services. We should not have women dying because our services in the hospitals that help those that are pregnant are not good at all. That's what we need. During this time of COVID-19, we shouldn't be talking about abortion. We should be talking about good maternal care. During this time of COVID-19, let the world help Malawi address the issue of COVID-19. There's no way we can talk about social distance in our primary schools when a primary school, a class that should be sitting 30 is sitting about 60, 70 kids in one class. So we should be, if anything, bring support to build more classrooms so that we can have even rotational schools.
We are very privileged to hear from you, to have your expertise, to know what is happening in Malawi as well, especially as so many people would like to know what's happening in Malawi. And the fact that people in the West, where some of this money is coming from, people don't even know or realize that organizations like COPUA, which is a local Malawian organization, is being funded, somehow through Western donor funds. So thank you so much for letting us know and for telling us the different things that have happened. We're really so grateful to have had you today.
Thank you so much, Ojo. It was a pleasure to come on this conversation. May God bless you. And may God bless Malawi and bless this world.
My name is Joy Masinde Divo. More commonly referred to as Joy Divo, and I'm the Executive Director of the East Africa Center for Law and Justice. I'm a human rights defender with a specific bias towards the protection of the family and religious freedom. And one of the things that inspire me to do what I do is because I realize that the fabric of every society is the family, and the disintegration of the family is actually a disintegration of society.
Joy, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me today.
Thank you for having me, Uju.
Can you just tell us a bit about what has happened in Kenya this year? What has been the experience in Kenya during this pandemic, from the beginning of the pandemic? Because I actually saw a couple of articles, particularly talking about joblessness in Kenya as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Beginning March this year is when there was a very robust response to COVID. And unlike the rest of the world, Africa has had relatively depressed figures. However, in typical fashion, we received advice from the WHO and from just looking at our partners around the world, and we chose to take the drastic steps of implementing lockdown and other measures to try and curb the spread of the virus. And so we saw a lot of people finding themselves in a situation where they lost their jobs, primarily because a very high percentage of Kenyans are actually self-employed. So if they do not go out to work, they do not make money. So if you cannot leave your home or you cannot travel inter-county, you cannot make any money. So in this kind of environment, you find that many Kenyans, the children have lost an entire school year. Many people have lost their employment. So it's really ridiculous right now, but we're doing the best we can, I guess, in the circumstances.
Already, African countries, a lot of the African countries, Kenya included, have already been in this vulnerable position even pre-pandemic. And then add the COVID pandemic that is affecting countries around the world. Add to that all the complications that come with it, then you have a really desperate situation. So you can imagine my shock, Joy, when I earlier this year heard about this so-called reproductive health care bill dated November 2019 that made it into your Senate. This bill was introduced by one of your senators, Senator Susan Kihika. Can you please tell me about this reproductive health care bill and how it even made it to Parliament at a time when so many people in Kenya were already struggling as a result of a pandemic?
Actually, it was quite a well-coordinated effort. I must give the perpetrators credit because it was in all our news bulletins, in all the major news houses. It was in the media every single day, in the print media, in the electronic media, on social media. Before people could even internalize what was going on, the bill was on the floor of the House and it was being debated. Like you say, it was during a pandemic. The sittings were few and far between. They were supposed to have been only for urgent national issues, but this suddenly became an urgent national issue. But the good thing is that we've had this fight for a long time. And so we're able to recognize that this was actually a follow-up with what we saw last year with the ICPD. And the conversation then was to try and integrate into the Kenyan education system more comprehensive sexuality education. And not just that, is to have adolescent-friendly centers that were run outside the schools where children could go to learn on quote-unquote responsible sexuality. As soon as we saw the news reports and the things coming out, we were very alert. And so we sought to find out what exactly is in this bill. And that is when we came to the realization that, you know what, this was the same old monster that was just in a new cloak. And therefore, we were able to mobilize and start lobbying against it. That because of the clamor by the Christian professionals, not just Christian professionals, even the Muslims were a very big part of the operation this time, as well as the Ministry of Health, as well as other well-meaning Kenyans, the parents groups that also came up and lobbied against it. The lobby was so strong that the Ministry of Education made a recommendation to the Senate Health Committee that they need to pull this back. And one of the recommendations we did was that in future, such things that deal with sexual reproductive health, and especially of teenagers, should not be a private member's bill, but should instead be a government-sponsored bill. Because government-sponsored bills, before they're tabled on the floor of the House, they undergo what we call stakeholder engagement forums. And at these stakeholder engagement forums, they get to listen to all the stakeholders involved, including parents, including medical professionals. So it's not just a private member's bill coming with whatever backing that they come with, because usually we found they have a lot of civil society backing, and so the stakeholder involvement is after the bill has been tabled and not before. So that's where we stand with the bill right now.
Right. So I am glad that you mentioned civil society organizations, having more influence than even the real stakeholders in the country. Can you tell me a bit about what has been happening with civil society organizations, particularly some of the Western ones and Western-funded ones that we see operating in and around Kenya?
Last year, the Kenya Christian Professional Forums actually commissioned a study to find out whether Kenyans are in support of, for example, abortion on demand. And so when they commissioned this report, one of the things that came out is that over 85% of Kenyans feel strongly against having abortion on demand. To a large extent, Kenyans are very much vehemently opposed to abortion on demand. Now, with this information, therefore, you wonder, now when somebody like Senator Susan sponsors such a bill, who are her backers? And one of the things that came out was a letter in support of her bill that was actually signed by civil society organizations that are working from Kenya. The curious thing with that is that most of them were foreign sponsored. And so it tells you that the agenda is not being set by Kenyan women, is not being set by the Kenyan society, is being sent by the backers and the donors. Because when you're facing big money, that's why I was talking about news reports. You would watch the lunch hour news and you've got 3 or 4 stories being covered from different parts of Kenya. I mean, this is not something that newsrooms could afford in COVID. Somebody was sponsoring those stories. Yes. This taking out of whole pages of advertisements in Kenya to get a whole page in a newspaper, you're looking at upwards 2 million shillings.
Oh my goodness.
Who is paying for that? That is not coming from anybody's pocket. So we are in a situation where there's somebody bankrolling this. It's obviously not Kenyan money that is bankrolling this, but whoever is bankrolling it is not stingy. They're quite generous in their support.
So can you talk a bit about this generosity that is coming from large Western donors, particularly Western nations, and also some Western private donors, and their generosity towards these issues that they are interested in, that then they'll kind of end up in a reproductive health care bill where their voices are being heard on the Senate floor in Kenya than the ordinary Kenyan person?
What happens, like in the Susan Kihika bill, the proposal was that they should not have to go through the government organizations to get this funding to the grassroots. And so it's actually finding a conduit so that, for example, the curriculum that you're using is not under scrutiny by the Ministry of Education. The people who are working with the children are not attached to any government ministry, and so therefore cannot be disciplined, whether it's by the Teacher Service Commission or under the social workers, or under the probation ministries, or under the children's services, that the training is being done and customized directly to children without the knowledge or participation of their parents. Kenya is still very much for the protection of family, very much for the protection of life. So it's one of those things that unless we are intentional about taking control of what is coming through the African nations as conditionalities attached to aid and funding, sometimes we could be letting in the devil with the detail.
This is also incredible, especially for the fact that it is being done in Kenya to Kenyans, mostly by people who are coming from outside, or at least people who are funded with dollars and euros and pounds, right? So the heavy money coming into African nations. You will see that money talks, right? Money talks, and this is money that has come from mostly Western donors, you know, kind of getting a handful of people in Kenya and empowering them so much with the money and getting them to make their own voices heard, not really the voice of the majority of the Kenyan people. Oh gosh, I thank you so much, Joy. I could talk with you forever. You know that, girl, and you are so amazing, and I think you do incredible work. And I very much look forward to when we can be in Kenya together, because we're doing this interview online, but I'm looking forward to a day when, you know, after all of this COVID problem, we can get together and speak on all these things, all these values that many of us across the continent of Africa share together. So I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to speak with us today. Thank you for being with us. Normally, when we are talking about abortion, it boils down to whether abortion is right or wrong. But that's not really what we are talking about today, because just listening to the experts that I've interviewed, it's so obvious that the majority of the people in most of the African countries are actually pro-life, and they want their countries to remain pro-life. So we as African nations have been constantly impervious to the idea of legalized abortion. So that's not really the subject matter today. However, the subject matter today is about Africa's wealthy Western donors. Should Africa's donors be in a position to set the tone of discussion and the agenda in these different African countries? Should it really be right that Africa's donors and the civil society organizations that they're sponsoring should be pushing an abortion ideology or an abortion agenda in the middle of a pandemic, at a time when people are suffering, people are jobless, people are thinking about where they're going to get their next meal? Should it then be at that point in time that the Senate or a parliament should be considering pushing through an abortion bill when nobody's looking? If you are in the West, this is what you should be thinking about. Your tax dollars and your tax pounds is making it into the pocket of a government who might in fact be using the money to influence the decisions and the policy-making processes in African countries. And so you should be asking for more accountability and for more transparency in how your tax money is being used by your government in the middle of a pandemic, where they should be intervening and helping people in dire need in different parts of the developing world. And if you're in Africa, you should raise your voices. You should be the one heard in your country. And it shouldn't be the case that a Western donor should influence the policy-making processes in your country. You should raise your voice. You should comment about it. You should reject this kind of neocolonialism. Yes, neocolonialism, the fact that a Western organization that has so much money can come to your country and completely eclipse your voice and your views should not happen at all in your country. So please, my brothers and sisters, I would like all of us to look into this matter, to see what has happened during the pandemic, to see just the depravity of the ideologue, the Western ideologue who is coming with a set agenda. And you should not actually let them win. We shouldn't let them win. We should let our voices be heard. And we should raise our voices until we are heard, until our views, our values are completely reflected by what happens in our country. Thank you.